Well, hello.
Hello and welcome.
This week, instead of our usual sermon recap, we are going to recap our time at annual conference this weekend.
Yay. Hang on for the ride.
And we trust that you can listen to worship. Reverend Wayne Barrett was preaching.
But
Great.
thanks to Wayne for filling in and for bringing us a message that was a message of challenge for us. Who doesn't need that?
So, annual conference.
Yeah. Yeah, a little bit of context, right? So
Yeah,
if people
well, why
want
do
to
we
know.
do it?
Yeah, so we said a little bit of this on video that we showed in worship on Sunday, but for pastors, their membership is in the annual conference, not in the local church, and so it's our annual gathering of our church, as it were. But it's clergy and it's laity, equal numbers of each, and we come together to worship. We come together to do the work of the church in terms of decisions that need to be made. We represent our state of Michigan to the larger general body of the denomination, so we may need to bring petitions from our annual conference to the larger church. So all that kind of business work of church is done, and also a whole lot of worship and other stuff.
Other stuff. Yeah, Methodist churches have been doing this since the Methodist conferences have been doing this since like the 1790s, and we follow in that tradition. It can get a little bit confusing because the annual conference is both an event, but also refers to a geographic location and members therein. So when we say we're going to annual conference, it's usually the week right after Memorial Day and several days therein. Where we have this time to be together and to affirm how we've been together and decide how we will be together.
Yeah, it's been a complicating thing. In 1784, when the first conference was held at Lover's Lane Church in Baltimore.
Lane.
Lovely Lane,
Yeah.
not Lover's Lane. Lovely Lane. Lover's Lane was a different thing.
Yeah, that's a different story.
That was a different John Wesley story. When that first conference was held, it was largely it was to form the Methodist Union out of the remnants of the Church of England, folks that were here, and a brand new group of pastors who were ordained by folks who had no authority to do that. Mm-hmm. But the critical thing is that virtually everybody who was at that Christmas conference were men, and mostly single. And so it's a very different thing today. So to take 3, 4, 5, annual conference used to be the better part of a week, and for everybody to take that amount of time away from churches and away from families, that's a big deal.
Yeah, it is. It was good to be there, but it is good to be back. So
Takeaways.
We thought we'd share some overall impressions to start us off. What was your overall impression, Barry?
We keep using this phrase, or at least I do, that we are fragile and evolving as a church, and we certainly had our places where we feel the fragility of who we are, and we're in a conference where we owned the fact that a significant number of churches, 8%, are disaffiliating in the state of Michigan, and that's hard. At the same time, my overall impression was that we were really ready to be church, moving beyond this place of disaffiliation and on to what it's going to mean to be a more a bigger umbrella, more progressive brand of Methodism in Michigan.
Let's see. My overall impressions are skewed by the fact this is the annual conference where I was ordained. So that took a big part and energy for me, and some celebration and still some processing. It's going to take a while for that to sink in. And I've been able to be a part of more than one annual conference. And in Michigan, particularly, it's the focus isn't as much on legislation. It's not as contentious, or it hasn't been as long as I've been here. And it really is more of, it's more presentations, it's more worship. There's kind of a more relaxed atmosphere. You usually don't get barked at if you don't follow Robert's rules. Or your mic doesn't get cut off immediately like it does in some other places. So the atmosphere is a little more jovial. And you can tell there are people you only see at annual conference, really. That's the only way you can spend significant time. And there's a lot of joy that brings in just the being together. I think especially after not being able to be together for a few years. That was my overall impression.
Yeah. Well, it was one of those conferences where I felt like I was on stage an awful lot in my variety of roles, but none of those were as significant for me as to be on stage with you and Geneva as you were ordained, and Paul Reisman as well, who was an intern here, and there's an awful lot of connections that. And annual conference is a place where I get to be reminded of all the connections, all the people that I've been involved with and have been involved with me over the years. My high school pastor received the conference cane this year because he's the oldest member and longest term member of the Michigan Conference, and it's tender and wonderful at the same time. But to be with you and Geneva and watch the bishop put hands on your head and remember for myself the weight of those hands, significant. So, yeah, it was an honor, and thank you for asking me.
Yeah, thanks for straightening my stole, standing with me.
Hey, you do it for me just about every Sunday morning, so fair is fair.
Well, yeah, now you'll get the chance. And that kind of leads nicely into celebrations. Celebrations from annual conference. One that I would love to share, I learned that of all of the annual conferences in the entire global UMC, the Michigan Annual Conference is the number one giver of the advance in UMCOR. And UMCOR is the United Methodist Committee on Relief. They do incredible work. Not just right after a disaster happens, but long-standing work in communities to rebuild, and all of our donations go straight to that disaster relief work. And I'm really proud of that. I didn't know that, so that was a very fun fact and a huge celebration.
True. And fun fact that you may not have known is that for a very long time, this church was the number one giver to UMCOR in the conference. West Michigan.
Yeah.
So when the conference used to be divided West and Detroit, when in West Michigan, Chapel Hill was the highest UMCOR giver.
Yeah. Well, and I know there are many folks connected to here that give weekly and monthly to UMCOR because of the amazing work they do, and that is meaningful and impactful and part of that big celebration.
Yeah. I don't know that I have other specific things. I chair the Board of Ordained Ministry, and I was, my heart was warmed at our clergy session. It went well. It was shaped around worship, and it was not contentious. And clergy sessions have a reputation for being places where things are nitpicked, and that mood has not been there in recent years, and it certainly was not this year. And the other piece is the celebration of retirees. We had almost 1,000 years in ministry in that class of retirees, and that's just a great thing.
Yeah, I think too a more general celebration is, like you said, the way we conducted ourselves with one another in the face of this ongoing, protracted, forever long church split. I was really proud of that. Because there are very strong differences of opinion. It's obvious there's some grief and hurt feelings. And in other conferences, it's gotten kind of nasty from the floor. And we didn't have that. It was, we were able to be civil with one another, and more than civil, I think, respectful.
Yeah, I think that we extended a fair amount of grace to one another through the week, and my prayer is that continues in our connections with each other. I sometimes feel like we do pretty good extension of grace when we're face to face, but then as soon as we hit social media, then we get contentious and nasty, and forget who and whose we are. And I thought the bishop did a good job of reminding us of that in a couple of ways through the week. And Bishop Bard is, for me, a phenomenal leader, and I'm always moved by how he administers his task as bishop and bringing people together, and has a great sense of humor. I mean, he does not take himself all that seriously. He makes sure that others take him seriously when they need to.
Yeah, he is. It's interesting because although I think he probably knows Robert's rules better than bishops I've been to annual conference with previously, he is so pastoral in his employment of those times where there's all these procedures that feel very cumbersome if you're new and might have a question, and it can be really nerve-wracking, and he creates a culture of welcoming those questions and environments. So I appreciate that in his leadership for sure. There are a number of conference-wide initiatives that I think are also worth celebrating. Readers to Leaders, which we participated in, and for us that was through our partnership with Haverhill. It was encouraging us to have connections with local churches, and also to give $300 for Freedom Schools here, and then $300 for school scholarships in Liberia. And they've done some incredible work. After the Storm is a new immediate disaster recovery that's within the U.S. That's doing some great work. So the Michigan Conference is doing some cool things that I think are worth celebrating.
Yeah, and doing some evolution in how we understand faith-based conference with how we can make better use of faith-based nonprofits. And so what used to be a committee of the annual conference doing disaster relief is now spun as a conference-related 501c3. So it's independent. So it does a number of things. It gives some fiduciary distance between the two entities, but it also allows that new entity to really grow and find funding that's beyond what the annual conference can do. It's a good thing. Yeah, a bunch of those I will be bringing as pastor connected to Faith in Action. I'll be bringing that as ideas for how we might budget.
Yeah. And what are some laments you would offer?
Well, certainly I lament the people that were not there, who have taken a stand against the denomination and have gone to have disaffiliated in order to join another denomination, most of them going to the Global Methodist Church. I lament that it feels like they really never had a good context to have conversations about that. It feels like most of the disagreements that we've had have been fundamental disagreements about the use and misuse of Scripture and the basic Wesleyan theology, and how we understand that to be alive and lived out in the world. So I lament those loss of relationships.
Yeah. Someone newer to the conference, I didn't have many of those ties. Things were pretty settled within their camps by the time I got here. So while I experienced, I think, a general grief over the harm that's been done to each side, but I think especially our queer siblings, I felt that. But for me, this has been, the church has been threatening to split for so long. I've never known a church, in my adult life that hasn't had that threat looming. So I didn't feel the same grief, but I was very aware of the grief and the sadness. I mean, people were in tears in that vote, and I can appreciate that we had some space for that. I lament the 20% cut of the conference budget. That's something I lament because folks were not paying their entire ministry shares, and budgets are often people, it's often staff positions.
Yeah.
And we had to cut some very significant conference staff positions that were just starting to get some momentum and do some really great work. All the folks that organized Advocacy Day, those jobs didn't fit into this budget because they had to make some really, really tough decisions. Because we have folks just affiliating and folks that can't pay what they need to. And that's just hard. I lament that. I think, I don't know that I have more to say other than that was just generally like, oh, that hurts because it's not numbers on paper. It's not programs that never started.
And that's the thing that people may not understand. We have as part of our budget at Chapel Hill, ministry shares falls under the Faith in Action team budget. And it's not insignificant. I think it's about $75,000, maybe more than that a year now, that we pay from Chapel Hill to the Michigan Conference of the United Methodist Church. And some of that goes beyond the conference to the general church. Some of it stays in the district, but all of that money is ways in which we do ministry in connected ways. So we pool what we've got as church resources, do ministries we could never do on our own. And that's been part of the very fiber of the United Methodist Church for a very long time. And it's one of the things that I lament as I look at the number of churches who have been able to pay anything in ministry shares, and that for the few churches like Chapel Hill that are paying 100%, it may feel unfair to us. It's not really. We're not paying any more. It's just that we're able to do as a conference with a reduced income budget is challenging.
Yeah.
Because then we end up spending more money on the administrative side and not enough on the program side, and the benefit doesn't come back to the larger community.
Yeah. And that's just tough. It's not, I supported the budget, right? So I voted for it. It's not that folks did the hard work of needing to do what was done. It's just the way that shakes out is often, ministries that I consider really vital, but they're not admin, and the admin stuff has to happen for any of the other stuff to happen. So that's a lament. That's really all I had in the lament category.
Well, we had a bunch of closing churches that we had to vote on. We got to look at the pictures and hear the stories of churches that will, either be torn down or sold to other denominations that are seeking to do something in that community, or they'll become breweries, brew pubs.
There are 9 churches this year.
Yeah, and that's hard. It's a hard thing.
Yeah, that's interesting because that was a little more bittersweet for me. But just because churches do have a life cycle, they cannot live forever, and people make the tough but necessary decision. And sometimes the individuals, some of those churches, again, like the industries moved away entirely.
Yeah.
And there are 3 people connected to them. And which is not to say that doesn't take away from any of the human beings that were formed in that space, or the people that moved and found new church homes and communities, as is often the case. There's usually mergers or a neighboring church. So yeah, I can see that as a lament.
Yeah, I mean, when I say it's my lament, I don't look at it as a failure of the people of the church. I do think that there's often a failure of vision.
Sure.
That something new is not being envisioned out of that thing that is dying off.
Yeah.
It's just again, resources matter, and we don't have the district superintendents, we don't have the staff people who once would have come and done a thoroughgoing kind of evaluation with the people and the community to see what was possible.
Yeah.
And that's not happening any longer. I mean, we used to be one of the things that I did as Metro Director in Grand Rapids when we were dealing with urban congregations. And I think those are really good ways for us to take something that's had its time and to see what new life might be there.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. When you cut budgets, any space for innovation goes into the cutting of the budget and the admin part.
Yeah.
We're not funding innovation beyond. It's really a self-preservation mechanism. So it's hard.
Right.
It's hard to be visionary and hold those things together. And that's
and that's right. And we end up doing what systems do, and that is that we maintain the system without maintaining the vision and the programming that helps us get to a vision.
Yeah.
But I guess if I came away with something, I felt better about the likelihood that we're going to come back to another annual conference that feels very different in terms of our ability to envision great things again.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of stability this annual conference, I think, provided folks. This was not one of a ton of innovation, but again, that's not really the place we're at. There's some mourning, there's some splitting.
Yeah, and anxiety. I mean,
yes.
we had an unfortunate happening with one of the meals at Grand Traverse Resort, and the meal didn't happen in the way that everybody was expecting it to happen in terms of timeliness and quality and all that, and people got quite nasty, and that was not a helpful thing, but it was certainly a manifestation of anxiety, I think.
Yeah, agreed. They could be like me and just leave and find tacos. Highly recommend going to find your own tacos.
We had Facebook updates from Jess and Tori with every taco visit, all the tacos, all the time.
That's my motto. All right, so let's talk about some legislation. Well, all the usual things. We have to pass things that are just kind of basic motions that are there every single year. A lot of them are, frankly, pretty perfunctory.
Like the budget, which we passed. It was the fastest budget pass ever.
It was bananas.
It was weird.
No comments.
Yeah.
It was moments.
It was just everybody had looked at it. Everybody was aware that we were running, $2 million less than we were last year. What are you going to do? And I was grateful that we didn't bring the wringing of our hands to the microphones, because that could have gone on for a very long time. At the same time, it felt weird to approve a budget without comment.
That was interesting. Yeah, it did make me consider. I'd have to sit and think about that a little bit more, about what that really means and looks like. Whether it was this holy conferencing moment of us just being like, okay, here's where we're at, and we have immense trust in CFNA, who have been telling us about this for a while. Did we do our due diligence, and do we feel like as a conference we have enough ownership over that budget or not? That's an interesting thing to think about.
Well, those are good things for Chapel Hill folks to think about with their own budget as we're doing that.
As we are doing that.
Excuse me. I also brought back all kinds of weird allergy things. So
yeah, staying in a hotel conference center is not ideal for your allergies. That whole airflow system. Although Grand Traverse is lovely, which is a little plug. Hey, next year we'll need some white folks to go. Dar Perkins went this year, super fun. She's a great person to hang out with.
We will need to. We're supposed to have 3 people.
Yeah.
And
we had some folks drop out.
We did.
After they were already elected. So next year, if you're looking for a good time and so some church conference work, let me tell you, annual conference could be for you.
If nothing else, it is amazing worship. And by the way, shout out, Caleb Williams did most of the worship music leadership, and as usual, phenomenal job.
Yeah.
With lots of help. Mm-hmm. All right, legislation. What else? So a lot of the stuff came from the North Central jurisdiction. Our representatives in North Central jurisdiction for pieces that'll be pushed on to General Conference, some significant changes. And I think all of those are passed.
Every one
of them. And 2 of them pretty significant movements around LGBTQIA plus issues, full inclusion. Trying to think of what some of the others were.
Removing discriminatory language, centering the experience and the voice of queer delegates within General Conference when it comes up. We had another one that was encouraging leadership with integrity, This hasn't really been a particular issue in our conference as much as others. But we're kind of in this tough place where there are still folks who are elected in spaces of leadership within the United Methodist Church who are in process of switching to the Global Methodist Church and probably shouldn't be making decisions for us as they've made their intentions clear to go to another denomination, just like we wouldn't let some Episcopal just walk on in and vote on stuff. So we were able to pass that with a pretty high majority. There weren't any that felt very specific to Michigan. A lot of it was affirmations of what's been done in jurisdictional conference or things preparing for General Conference 2024. This was the last annual conference before that next General Conference.
From your lips to God's ears.
Yeah, it's been postponed a lot. Our poor elected delegates have had
the longest serving delegates in the history of Methodism.
Yes, yeah, and my home conference, for example, they had some folks in the delegation that are on the steering committee for the GMC. So that leading with integrity bit was really for conferences that are in those positions saying, hey, you shouldn't be voting at General Conference anymore. Right. It's a conflict of interest. We don't have any of that. We have had folks that need to leave the delegation, but really for familial reasons or because they were elected bishop, like Bishop Kenitha. Big Messiah. The other significant piece of legislation that was passed, which will, if it goes forward, which would be tremendous, is creating a regional central conference within the United States of the Methodist Church. Right now, we kind of have this, it's really a colonial understanding where we have regional conferences that are outside of the U.S., but like the United States is like the main church. And this would really be a movement to create the North American, Methodist Church into its own regional conference, which would both decenter the U.S. in decision-making and give the United States some contextual freedom within the Book of Discipline such that it might reflect the values of those of us that have chosen to stay while affirming the central conferences that are in different places contextually.
Right. So it would give more of us freedom to be able to. So if we did not each have our own Book of Discipline, we would at least have subunits of the Book of Discipline that would apply to each of the conferences independently.
Yeah.
So that we can do what we do. Because an awful lot of what hung us up in 2019 was a lot of politicking that went on to get more conservative countries to back more conservative southern states of the United States, and in voting at the General Conference, it was just sketchy, and that happens in the church, and we need to do what we can do to help make that not happen in the church.
Yeah, and so this would really encourage a little more transparency. It would also allow us to maintain to be a global body, recognizing that different spaces are going to make their own decisions and should have the autonomy to make their own decisions, and the United States shouldn't be, the last voice in all of this. Just because Methodism was in an effect born here does not mean the same way we do it has to be the default.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And the great part of that is that, for me, is that in all the places where we may have disagreements, might be around human sexuality, might be about particulars of how we read Scripture or understand doctrine, we can still come together as a connectional church and be unified in our support of believing that hungry people should be fed, and that unhoused people should be housed, that war should be the work of the church, anti-war should be the work of the church.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there's far more that unites us, and we can spend our time on those things rather than on the things that divide us.
Yeah. So that was really the recap. There was one piece on the consent calendar that was actually in my legislative committee. So we have this interesting thing where there's legislation as a part of what we do together. And our church, in a lot of ways, is modeled after the United States government. So we have a committee that gets together. You're assigned to it, and you're assigned pieces of legislation. And the way we're doing this right now is on Zoom. I'll be honest, it's not my favorite, but it is efficient and it is less expensive. So I can appreciate why decisions were made to do it. It's hard to have meaningful conversations around legislation. But you have about 200 people in a legislative committee. And for something to go on our consent calendar means that it has to get 9/10 of the body to approve it. So 90% of people to approve it. There was only one piece of legislation that did, and it was particularly encouraging the United States to support justice initiatives for Palestinians that are joint efforts with Jewish groups here in the United States and other caucuses that kind of have that same value. So that was like 92%, and that got on the consent calendar. And every other piece was really in the high 80s that kind of made it. And there was some other legislation that was ultimately withdrawn, which was probably for the best. But yeah, it was pretty low key in terms of legislation this year. A lot in preparation for General Conference, and way more focus on reports and celebrating transitions and mourning transitions and worship.
So an awful lot of this is on the Michigan Conference UMC website. You can click on the annual conference tab, and you can watch an awful lot of the goings on. I would encourage you to check out the two pieces of worship with Gracie Matthew, who is phenomenal, lead pastor at Evanston First, I think.
Yep.
And just did some really, really good stuff with us. So yeah.
Yeah, what would be a final takeaway? What is the thing you're taking with you from this annual conference?
The church is of God and will be preserved to the end of time. And every time we come together at annual conference, we sing in some shape or form, and Are We Yet Alive? Old Charles Wesley hymn. And it's a reminder. It's not really a question of are we yet alive. It's just like we are, even after what's gone on, even with those that we are missing as we do the memorials every year, and as we celebrate retirements, and as we see new people coming into this really difficult time in the life of the church, folks coming in to pick up the banner of ordination and commissioning and local pastoring, and so my takeaway is that we are still very much the church, vital. I feel, frankly, more hopeful after annual conference than I did before.
Yeah, I think for me, my takeaway is more individual, more self-centered, as it was my ordination.
Sure.
And Bishop's message was kind of a riff on the St. Francis prayer, make me an instrument of your peace. And he tied that in with make me an instrument, and went straight into jazz, his love of jazz, which makes its way into a lot of sermons.
Yep.
He is both well-read and well-listened. And so it was entitled Make Me a Saxophone, just the need for improvisation in ministry. And I heard very clearly an affirmation and a call to bring who we are into the ministry. And I've struggled and been hesitant with that, because at times it feels like the church has a particular view of what they want leadership to be and what they want pastors to be. And I don't know that it's often bombastic, loudmouth, middle-aged women, but here I am.
Here I am, Lord.
Yeah. And it's particularly significant as we've, ordained queer folks. And so to hear the call to bring all of who you are, all of your identities into your leadership, Bishop has a really good way of doing that is not alienating of folks that perhaps have other views, but there's a clarion call to those that kind of have an ear for what he's saying. He's really, really beautifully nuanced in that sense. And I heard that, and it was kind of like, okay, like I've gone through this, like I've had the hands on my head, like I can breathe, and this whole class that I'm with, these folks that I've journeyed with, we're allowed to be who we are in this space.
Yeah, I know I had my term, but I'm going to tag team on it. I think one of the things that struck me is, as much as we've tried to lead as a conference around inclusion, particularly around LGBTQIA+, I was just really heartwarmed to see our embracing of people's ministries without having any sense that we need to call out that they are representing a particular group at a particular time. It's like we are so excited to have you because of these gifts that you bring, because of this person you are, because of this set of skills that we really need at this time. And it did not feel at any point to me, of course, it may be different for folks who were in those places, but as I was observing, I was not watching tokenism going on.
Yeah, it did not feel, I at least from Bishop, from that message, and I think from what we were doing, it was an invitation to bring all of who you are and not to just be highlighted in one segmented part of who you are because of that, because of that identity. I felt that too, and there wasn't that kind of calling out or the centering of like, hey, your identity above you as a person or your gifts and skills and calling. That felt good, and that's a takeaway. My takeaway is take thou authority. That was now I've had those words spoken to me, magically placed over my head.
I know. Be afraid. Be very afraid.
Yeah. So overall, it was good, and we're exhausted. We're tired. It is emotional, and it is physically tolling just to be sit in a ballroom for 12 hours a day. And then the chairs that are the closest together as they could possibly be.
And they're crummy chairs, and I was on for so much, and I am an introvert, and I'm talking to people everywhere because one, I like to do it because it matters to me what they have to say to me as chair of the board or whatever, and but it is exhausting, and I feel like had we had any sense, we would have just taken the next week off, but unfortunately that's not happening because ministry goes on.
A great time, a good time, a tiring time. Annual Conference 2023.
And there we go, a special edition.
We will be back to the regularly scheduled sermon recaps next week. See you then.